Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again in this video, which is the third in a series of videos focusing on data visualization with React and D3. We're just going to set up a set of axes for our bar chart. We won't actually add the bars to our chart today, we'll do that in another video. But actually setting up the axes in and of itself is quite a chore, so hopefully by the end of this video you'll be more comfortable with manipulating both D3 and SVG elements. So if you recall in the last video, we added this SVG canvas to our project. We gave it a background color of green, which is not so good because our axes have a default color of black. So we should probably set our background color to something that makes those axes stand out a little bit better. So I use beige usually. It's just a color I like. You can use whatever color you like. What did I do there? All right. Good. So the reason I set a background color at all is because I like to see the canvas I'm working on, so I know where the edges of the canvas are and I know where all of my elements are with respect to those edges. Also, I've added a little bit of data for our chart. That's this right here. These x values correspond to the values you'll see on your x-axis. You know, each value corresponds to the value aligned with an individual tick mark. And the y values are just arbitrarily chosen values, and they will be represented as the height of the bars that we add later. So for now, let's set up a scale for our x-axis. We're going to use a D3 function called scaleBand. Now, this function allows us to keep a one-to-one correspondence between these values here, these x values, and the labels for our x-axis, you know, the ones that correspond to the tick marks. This would correspond to the first tick mark, this would correspond to the second tick mark, and so on. So basically these are discrete values for a discrete bar chart. Now we'll append to this xScale the domain function, and this takes as an input an array, and that array will just be our x values. And then we'll also chain on a range function, and this also takes in an array as an input. Now it takes in this array there will be two values, right? The beginning x value of our axis and the ending x value of our axis. So take a look at your canvas. If we want to stretch our x-axis from the extreme left to the extreme right-hand side of the canvas, then we would set up our x values in the or our range values in the following way. We would start off at x equals 0, and we would end up at a value x equal to the width of the canvas. Now we define our x-axis. And we use a function called axis bottom. And the bottom axis of a chart would be the x-axis. And we pass to that, that function axis bottom the x scale. So now we need to append this axis to our SVG. We append it to a group. So first what we're going to do is we're going to append to our SVG a group element, which is just denoted by G. If you recall in the first video, we appended a group element to our canvas, and then we appended to that group a couple of different shapes, and when we made changes to one shape, we made changes to all the shapes that were in that group. Right, and here we will use the call function to get the x-axis. Okay, and if we go over to our canvas now, we can see that our axis is displayed, but it's not where we want it to be. We want it to be at the bottom or near the bottom of the canvas, and you would think with a function called axis bottom that would have done that for us, but it doesn't. We have to do it ourselves. So in mathematical terms, what we need to do is translate this axis downward or along the y-axis. So if we want it to be exactly at the bottom, we could just shift it an amount equal to the height of the canvas. And so what we could do is use the attribute function and the transform attribute. Set up a template literal. We'll use translate. And we're not going to translate it in the x direction because the axis is sitting where we want it to be horizontally. So we'll keep that 0. And then we'll translate it in the vertical direction, as I said, an amount equal to the height. Now before we switch to the canvas view, what do you think you're going to see? I'll give you a couple of seconds. You can pause the video and think about it. Okay, did you think about it? What answer did you come up with? Let's take a look. So if you said that the axis would be moved completely off the canvas, you were right. So let's remove that height. Take a look at our canvas once again. You see that the axis, the very top part of the axis, is hugging the top part of the canvas. So when we shift it down, all the way down to here, the very top of the axis is hugging right here. So we're just not seeing it. If we were to bring it back up a little bit, then we would see it. So for example, we could say height divided by 2. All right. And somehow I screwed that up. That divided by 2 should not be there. It should be right here. All right, and if we do that, then we can see that the axis is right there in the middle of the canvas, vertically speaking. But we don't want it to be there. We want it to be closer to the bottom. So we can tweak things a little bit. For example, what we can do is we can just subtract out a value of, say, 30 pixels. And the reason why we subtract is because negative y, or moving in the negative y direction, means moving upward, and we want it to move upward. So let's take a look at our canvas. So the axis is okay now, at least for now. We'll move it around later. Now, if we don't want the axis to stretch from the extreme left end of the canvas to the extreme right end of the canvas, we can add margins. So go back to your code. Underneath where we set up the width and the height, let's define an object called margin, and it'll have 4 properties: top, bottom, left, and right. Now if you're wondering why I set it up 20, 20, and 30, 30, go down to where we attached our SVG to the body of the page. You can see here we have this attribute, preserve aspect ratio, which means we're going to keep that same 3:2 ratio that we have here. So that's why I've set things up that way here, just so the chart doesn't get skewed. All right, now that we've added those margins, we need to expand our view box. All right, so we need to take into account those margins. So we'll say width plus margin dot right plus margin dot left. All right, and that'll add in those margins. Now if we take a look at our canvas, our x-axis is still snug up against the left-hand side of the canvas. So what we need to do is we need to move it over. We need to translate it a bit to the right. Now the starting point for the axis now is 0. So if we'd like to move it in an amount equal to the margin, what we can do is we can go to, for our x scale, where we define the range, we can set it not equal to 0, but to margin dot left. Okay, and if we take a look at our canvas now, indeed we have shifted it over by the 30 pixels. But unfortunately the right hand side is skewed a little bit. We want there to be the same distance from the left end of the canvas to the beginning of the axis here as there is from the end of the axis to the right hand side of the canvas. So if our starting point is here and we've shifted that over, that means we need to shift our ending point over an equal amount. So go back to your code. So we'll just say width plus margin dot left. Okay, and then if we take a look at our canvas now, we see that our axis is centered. Now, going back to the code, recall when we appended our x-axis, we set it to be a distance from the top of the canvas equal to the height minus 30 pixels. But I'd rather have it equal to the height minus the top margin, which is actually 20. So let's go ahead and change this to margin.top. And it moves the axis down just a little bit. Okay, and later on we'll have to do that when we add the y-axis as well. Okay, so now our axis has, as its tick mark labels, numbers, but we could also add text strings as labels if we like. So I've already created an array of excuse me, strings here corresponding to months of the year. So we can easily just go down to our domain and put in months as our input array. And since we're not using these anymore, you can just comment those out. All right, so take a look at your canvas. You've got the month names there, but you know, they could be, I mean, now they're probably okay. I don't really like it, but you know, because some of the strings, the character strings are longer than others, they seem bunched up towards the right-hand side of the axis. But we could rotate those text labels to make them seem less on top of each other. All right, so if you go back to your code, right, what we can do is we can use the rotate attribute, or sorry, the transform attribute with the rotate function. And let's say we'll rotate it by 90 degrees. And somehow I screwed that up. Okay, I know what I did. So right now, if you look at your canvas, you don't see the axis at all, right? And that's because we've confused the D3 library. So what we need to do is we need to select the text, right, before we do anything to it. So we'll use the select all function, and we're going to select all of the text. Okay, now if you go back to your canvas, you'll see that you have rotated your text. Unfortunately, the positioning of the labels is not very good. Now think about how things were rotated. What was the pivot point around which these labels were rotated? It actually turns out that the pivot point is where the tick mark meets the x-axis, right? So off screen, I'm going to rotate it back and watch how the text labels move. You see they rotated around that pivot point that I was just explaining or telling you about right here where the tick mark meets the x-axis. Right. So knowing that, and say making a different rotation, for example, we could make a rotation of 45 degrees. Let's take a look at what we have. Right, what do we need to do now to get these labels lined up where we want them to be? All right, so we can just start tweaking things a little bit. Let's go back to the code. Now say I want to move those labels downward. All right. And let's say I'm just going to make a massive change so you can see the difference. Let's say I want to move them downward. Right, so I'll set the y value equal to 40. So let's go back to the canvas. Wow, look at where they moved. I'm going to restore, I'm going to undo that change I just made, and I want you to watch how the text labels move. So here we go. So if you notice, they moved diagonally upward. They didn't move straight upward. They moved diagonally, meaning northeast, basically. And the reason they did that is because the X and Y translations, or the X and Y movements, correspond to a new reference frame, a rotated X and Y reference frame that's lined up with the labels themselves. So when you move upwards in the Y direction, you're actually moving perpendicular to the text label. All right, so we don't want to move it too much because we're going to end up too far away, because we're moving in both the X and the Y direction when we move diagonally. So let's make small moves. So for example now, and we'll go back to the code. Let's set Y equal to 0. Okay, and if you take a look at your canvas, what we've done is we've basically anchored the center of the text right to where that pivot point is. All right, so now we can move with respect to that. So if we want to move it downward a little bit, we can use something called the dy attribute. And if you're familiar with calculus, then you know what dy is, or dx. Sorry, you're not looking at the code right now. Let me move it over. So what I've done is I've added this attribute here, this dy. This means a small change in y, so I gave it a 10 pixel change. All right, let me undo that just so we can see what happens. So I'll switch you back to the canvas view. So you see it moved it back in the northeast direction. So if we're going to do a dy change, we're going to have to make it a big one, right? So before we do that, let's make an x change. So let's, where are we? Let's do x and say 10. So you may not really notice the big change. So what I'm going to do is leave it here, and I'm going to double it. I'm going to say let x equal 20, and watch how the labels move. So they're shifted along that x-axis, which is rotated to be parallel with the text labels. And our labels have gotten a little bit closer to where we want to be. Now we want them to be down a little bit. So let's use, let's make it y5. Alright, so if you're wondering what I did, I just changed the y attribute to 5. Alright, not quite enough. Let's make it y10. Go back. It's getting better. Alright, but it's still not quite where we want to be. So if we shift it in the x direction, which means down and to the right, for example, we can say let x equal 30. What happens? We look at the canvas and it's getting a little better. But you see, it's really hard to deal with things this way. There's something that we can do to make things a lot easier, right? And you're probably going to say, why didn't you just show us that in the first place? But, you know, unfortunately, when you learn, you got to go through a little bit of pain. I certainly did. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of this. All right. So if we return to our canvas view, we're back to where we were. All right. And rather than having the tick mark lined up with the center of each text string, let's have it lined up with the first character of each string. What we're going to do is we're going to make the first character our anchor point. Okay, and we can use an attribute called text anchor. And I realize, again, you're not watching what I'm doing. So what I've done is I've added this attribute here, text anchor. Okay, by default, text anchor is middle. Excuse me. Let's set it to start. Now if you go back to your canvas, hold on a sec, I need a drink of water. Sorry about that. So you can see that the tick marks are lined up with the first character of each string. So now our anchor has been shifted, and the distance it's been shifted is half the width of the character string. So again, we can rotate around that pivot point. Remember, that pivot point is right where the tick mark meets the axis, right? And we can do it again by 45 degrees. All right, let's go back to our canvas view. Now you can see almost immediately we're in a better position. We're not quite where we want to be, but we're still pretty good. And in fact, you probably could leave things here if you'd like, but personally I'd like to have the tick marks directly over the first character. So if you think about what we can do, we can move things in the y direction. Remember, the y direction is going to be perpendicular to the axis that runs parallel to the text. Let's not manipulate the y direction first. Let's do x first, and that means we're going to move it in a direction parallel to the direction of the text, which means down and to the right. So we're going to move it this way. And let's do this. Let's go 10. Okay, now take a look. That's quite a bit better. In fact, I think I'm okay with stopping right there as far as setting up the x-axis for now. So you can see that if you set your text anchor to start from the beginning, things are a lot easier if you're going to rotate your text. Okay, enough with the x-axis for now. Let's move on to the y-axis. So in the same way that we created an x scale, we'll have to create a y scale. And this time we're not going to use scale band, we're going to use scale linear. Basically, this applies a linear function to the y values in your y vals array. If you left them as they would be in pixels, right? So the height of your bars would be like 7 pixels and 8 pixels, 9 pixels. That would be really hard to see. So we want to scale these up to where they're on par with the height of our axis, or at least some significant percentage of the height of our y-axis. So that's what the scale linear function does, is it applies, it multiplies by a factor that's determined by the height of your axis, which for now is, if we said it was going to be equal to the height of the SVG, would be 400 pixels. Right, so our maximum value of 9 would be scaled up to 400 pixels, right? Even though it would display as 9. All right, that's a lot of talk. Let's just try to do that. So first we need to set up our domain, as we did before. It takes an array as input. So in this case, we'll start with 0. Excuse me. And we'll go to the maximum value in our array, in our y values array. So if we just take a look at it quickly, we can see that that maximum value is 9, right? So to get that value out of the array using D3, we can use the function max, right? D3.max, and we can put in our y values array. So it'll find that maximum value and it'll use it. All right, now we, excuse me, I've been talking too much today. We'll use the range function, And again, it takes as an input an array. Now, naively, we could just put in a 0 to start, and we could run it to the height of the SVG. All right. And then we can go ahead and define our y-axis. And we don't use axis bottom, we use axis left, because the y-axis would be the left axis, and we feed to it the y scale as an input. All right, and then just like before, we're going to append a g element to our SVG, and then we'll use the call function to get our y-axis. Okay, so let's take a look now at our canvas. So that doesn't look very good. So one thing we have to take into account is that if we have our x-axis moved over from the left side of the canvas by an amount equal to the left margin, we should translate the y-axis as well. All right, so in the x direction. So going back to your code, we'll use the transform attribute one more time. Translate as a template literal. And for x, we want to move it an amount equal to the left margin, so margin.left. Okay, so there's the axis there. All right, but now you notice that it extends too far beyond the x-axis. So what we can do, and by the way, we need to also set the y value as well for the translation. We're going to translate it well, let's leave it as it is for now. Okay, so take a look. You see that it extends beyond the x-axis. Probably I didn't switch over to show you that before. So how can we fix this? All right, well, the first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to go back and adjust our range a little bit. Okay, so here, if you look at your range, let's start off with, since we're moving, we want to think about moving from lower to higher. Let's start off with height, right, and then end at 0. Okay. But we don't want it to be all the way down the height. We want to subtract out that top margin, right? So we'll say height minus margin.top. Okay, so if we go back and we look at our canvas, we see that the x-axis, so the y-axis is there, and now it's lined up a little better. Okay. But we didn't really expand the view box in the vertical direction, so let's do that now. So go back to your code. So again, we added the right and left margins to the width, but to the height we should also add margin.top plus margin.bottom. Okay. All right, so if you take a look at our canvas now, there's a little bit of a problem. We're not seeing any of the tick marks displayed. So if we go back and we look at what we did for the x-axis, right, we created an x scale. We gave as a domain the months in the year, and that was fine. Right, we ranged it from margin left to width plus margin left. Right, so this is the starting of the axis. This was the end. We created the axis using x scale, and then we appended it to a g element. All right, so going down with the y-axis, All right, so our domain was set up correctly. Our range is set up okay. Actually, no, our domain is not set up correctly, so I can see the mistake now. Remember, the inputs have to be arrays. Okay, so now go back to your canvas and you see the axis as it, somewhat as it should be, not quite exactly the way we want it. But one thing I'd like to point out is if you go back to where we define the range, we said height minus margin top as the beginning of the axis and 0 as the end, right? Which means if you're looking at the canvas, we're starting from here and we're moving upward. But recall, that was after we made a change, right? So if we leave the way it was originally, right, where we went from 0 to the height minus margin top. Okay, go back and look at your canvas now. You can see that our axis runs from 0 to 9 this way, you know, from top to bottom. That's not what we wanted. That's why we reversed everything. So going back. All right, and if we look at our canvas, we can at least see that it's increasing as we go upward. So that's good. We don't quite see everything we want to see. Here where our axis is running into the top of the canvas, we'd like to stretch things out vertically a little bit. All right, so how can we do that? Well, we just increased the size of the view box in the vertical direction here. All right, so how about let's double this. Let's make this 60, this 60, this 40, and this 40. And actually that does not do what we want it to do. It just keeps things, it just minimizes everything, so don't do that. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to make our axis a little bit shorter. Our y-axis. So instead of this being 0, let's have this be, we want to move it down. How much? Let's just say an amount equal to the margin from the top. Okay, so that moved it down. You can see here. But unfortunately, that means we now need to move the x-axis downward to keep up with it. So if you, well, first of all, you can see that if we do that, our text is probably going to run off the canvas. So we should probably increase our top and bottom margins a little bit. So go back to your margins. So again, we want to keep our aspect ratio. So make these 40, 40, 60, and 60. Okay, so if you look at your canvas now, at least it's well contained within the canvas. Now we just need to move our x-axis down. So think about how you can do that. You want to shift the axis downward, so you're going to make a translation in the y direction. So for your x-axis, all right, so we translated it height minus margin top, right? But actually, what happens if we just get rid of this? All right, let's take a look. And there's our axes. So they're lined up now and they're showing what they should be showing. It's not perfect and we can do better. We can tweak things and we'll do that in upcoming videos. But for now, I hope that you see how much of a chore it can actually be to set up your axes. Remember, I'm not a D3 master, so this took me a little bit of time. Even after having done this plenty of times, I do this sometimes for work. So don't feel bad if you do this and it doesn't all click right away. I think there's a learning curve with D3 that throws a lot of people off, even really good developers. So anyway, that's enough for now, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll actually add some bars to our chart. So as always, thanks for checking me out, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.